Morning to everyone. Igor asked me to talk about my early ethnobiological work in Indonesia, which a lot of people here remember and use the collections from that are still here, and particularly then how that very intensive work with a particular indigenous people in Eastern Indonesia informs my later and present work on legacy museum collections and material culture, not only here, but also in conjunction with the colleague museums in Southeast Asia. So I have this title slide, and even though I realized we were supposed to be talking about terrestrial ecosystems, it refers to some of the fish collected anyway, so we have to sneak those in because populations are coastal, but also because I want to acknowledge the tremendous work in those days done by the Smithsonian Oceanographic Sorting Center, which does not exist anymore, in processing and distributing the collections to all the other departments here. Botanical and biological, as well as our permits from Indonesia and distributing the Indonesian samples to Bogor and my colleagues there, to whom I also express thanks to the Indonesian Institute of Sciences and the Universitas Khairun, which was my local sponsor. I worked on Halmahera Island with the Tobelo people. It's a very linguistically complex area of a phylum level group of languages called the West Papuan languages. All Papuan languages are assumed at some point to be related to each other, but no known clear relationship. The North Halmaheran group, and Tobelo is the largest of them. Halmahera itself is the largest island in the Moluccas in Eastern Indonesia. And because of a lot of multilingualism and a strict in-law name taboo, which requires people to have a high level of synonymy in their daily conversations. These things all have a big effect on folk classification and naming, which was really the primary subject matter of my research. And I want to express that trying to understand an indigenous classification of biological animals and plants is not a matter of lining things up with a Linnaean or scientific taxonomy. It's really understanding a symbolic system with a lot of local indigenous uses and interpretations. And that's really what the classification system is used for. Heavy lexical emphasis is important, partly because people use language to describe not only the animals and plants, but also how they're used, and medicinally, symbolically, and so on. This is the kind of place we're talking about. The Tobelo people live in small villages on the island of Halmahera, mostly coastal, but there are also indigenous Tobelo populations deep in the interior. I will mention about folk classification and the Tobelo classification. There are a lot of characteristics of what is really a systematic classification system of its own. And symbolic system of its own that don't correspond to our ideas of biology, but are very important to them. Some things are not expressed in their classificatory system, but their knowledge about animals and plants, just like we have other types of knowledge that are described when people talk about things. This type of animal, Opeopeoto, for example, is imagined that this actually comes from a faunal form, a tree leaf that becomes this kind of animal. Similarly, long mangrove sort of fruits that fall into the ocean can become some of the range of long, slender fish that are in the mangrove water areas. And so the movement from one group of animals to the other is a transformation that takes place that sometimes is not recognized in the classificatory system. Others are, where one type of animal or plant is considered the mother or child or master servant or the true one and the counterfeit one. So these can cross-cut the overall biological classification. Now, just as our classificatory system is based on the idea of evolution, I suppose we could say there is definitely throughout Southeast Asia, recorded for a long time, hundreds of years of ethnographic work anyway, throughout Indonesia and Malaysia, this idea that there really should be a proper name for every easily visible animal and plant, and that these names were known by the ancestors, but that knowledge is declining with every passing generation. And it's, at the same time, there are interventions from ancestors that bring back knowledge to people. So people are often using their classificatory system to go out and find new things, new medicines, new animals, new plants. But that knowledge declines on many grounds, and particularly if the magical or medicinal uses for animals and plants is given away too often, or it's made too public, or particularly if it's sold, then its efficacy declines. But for that reason, there's also a real way in which the Tobelo who disagree about what is the proper nature of the classificatory system, or the name, or the placement of a particular type of biotic form that they see, have a way of trying to figure out what is the correct one. And that's a very important element of a classificatory system that is a well-functioning classificatory system. But this connection with the ancestors, I was reminded of when I saw this picture of one of the people in Pasir Putih on Halmahera, and I was asking them to name the insects and describe its uses and so on. And he looked at one of them and he told me, you know, Paul, you are going to have to find somebody who was friendly with Adam and Eve to tell you the name of that thing. And the reason is that the idea of the ancestors was so long ago that you'd have to find somebody who really was very early. At the same time, the big collections were made. So we have here over 100,000 fish that I brought back, about 4,000 birds, and many other things in the botany and zoology and entomology departments. And I want to mention that the idea was not just to collect a lot of animals and plants, but information about them too, because the local uses of animals and plants are very widespread throughout the language, and that kind of information includes symbolic and expressive uses of animals as verbs and so on. I mean, to do something like an animal, to be sick, for example, Ohilowana is the name of a garfish. Garfish are these fish with long toothed jaws. They glide along on the top of the water and just with their tails, you know, for a while, and then they go under the water and then they come up again. So an earache that appears and then goes away and appears and goes away, that's to be affected by the garfish disease, Ina Hohilowana. And the medicine for it then uses folded pineapple leaves to put your medication or herbal plants that are themselves identified with characteristics of other animals and plants into your ear. The idea being that the pineapple dispenser is also like the garfish. Owongama is the name for a hermit crab, which is an animal that will sort of pull itself and hide anytime somebody disturbs it. So Inawangawama is the name of an ailment, a muscle ailment that comes, and then with the slightest little medication or massage or anything, it goes away, but it keeps coming back until treated properly. And so just thousands of these kinds of examples are throughout the Tobelo culture. And understanding the classificatory system is really understanding a broader sort of symbolic system. For this purpose, we did a lot of collecting. His person that we taught how to, I guess taught him how to skin birds, and thanks to people here who taught me. We had to make a lot of, local modifications of normal procedure, I guess you could say. Ornithologists asked us to record the iris color. Well, of course, this is a language that has only 3 words for color. I mean, brown and red are the same, green and blue are the same, and so on. So I took a Munsell color chart and numbered things, and then you have the eye color number. And there's a copy of that Munsell color chart, which is, I have to say, covered with blood a little bit, but anyway, and bird blood, but it's in the accession records. This was problematic for me when I first returned after not speaking English for over a year. So this is the kind of thing that we did for purposes of gathering collections, and the results were recorded initially in this book, Folk Biology of the Tobelo People. So I just want to summarize some ideas of how the classificatory system works. And this is a diagram on this lowest level here. That's more or less what's called basic terms. Almost every people on Earth basically has a a level that's like that. It's the largest level of most terms. That's people that have been studied so far anyway. And the diagram doesn't extend that out because that's most of the names for animals and plants are always on that level. So fish, for example, there are 2 listed, but there are 146 basic names, and those can be 2 or 3 levels down, distinguished into further categories. But what I want to say is this part looks like a taxonomic system, and it is the taxonomic sort of component of the folk classificatory system. And taxonomy is a very important part of folk classification everywhere, but there are also plenty of non-taxonomic components of this system. First, I want to point to the fact that the higher levels are in capital letters because they're posited covert categories. This is commonly used in semantic studies. And I think you could say positing covert categories is a violation of the principle of parsimony in describing a language because you're positing stuff that isn't there, but actually you need those sometimes to have the more parsimonious description of a language for a couple of reasons. We don't have time to describe it all here, but I will just mention 2. One is the cohyponymy, when you have 2 things that you have a set of things that are in a contrast set and the same term is in a different contrast set. The fact that they're in one contrast set implies that there's a category that's a higher level category, even if it's not named, which is a covert category. Wood and tree are the same word. So if tree contrasts, gota contrasts with vine and so on in one way, then in another, vine and herbaceous weed, let's call it, that's a contrast set. So there is a sort of plant-like faunal form category implicit in that because the same word would contrast with other things in other sets. And another method is definitional implication. So for example, if we didn't have a word for duck, but we had a word for quack and lots of other verbs that only ducks do, we would be able to imply that to properly identify and define what those words mean, you'd have to have a category. And that definitional implication is the category duck, which we didn't name. So this actually happens in languages. And so where you are really confident of a covert category means well, a lot of that kind of evidence applies. And it's useful in predicting the behavior of individuals and the uses of the animals and plants. So on that basis, we can develop, with the study of hundreds of examples of plants and animals used by an indigenous people, what is the sort of total symbolic system? Now, when you include the total symbolic system, you have to be including a lot of things that are not taxonomic. That is to say, things that have a dual position or cross-cutting. For example, suppose you had a mammal, like a hamster or whatever, that looked a little bit like a mollusk and a little bit like a hamster. And, you know, it was, you had 2 types of it, you know, there are 2 subgroups of that or subspecies, or that's a genus with 2 species or whatever. One of the species then would be in the mollusk category and the other would be in the mammal category. This is, of course, ridiculous in the scientific taxonomy. It happens all the time, especially if you remember that the basis is not evolution, the basis is ancestral knowledge and usefulness for a total symbolic system and a total classificatory system for a particular indigenous people, for which these people have uses, have a lot of use. You also have the vast majority of these types of things. There are a few that are that don't breathe, as I said, the verb to breathe cannot be applied to them. But the vast majority are sexual badic forms, that is to say, all are expected to have male and female. Tobelo know what male and female is in terms of, they don't have to know, they see butterflies or grasshoppers, whatever, mating, they don't always know which one is male and female, but they more or less assume that that's a, you know, at least sometimes a male and a female. And but that's not the only meaning of the male and female as it's applied to classes of animals and plants. So, and I'll just go through some examples, but basically a male version of a plant and a female version of a plant, when you collect them and bring them back, you often discover they're in completely different biological families. So this is a sort of componential definition of what the covert categories come out to be. I think I'm going to run out of time if I spend too much time on this, but let me just use an example. Here's Ohaiti. Ohaiti was, there's two types of it. It's a basic class, and it's cross-cutting the higher level classes of trees and vines. So you have one of its subgroups, Ohaiti ogumini and Ohaiti ogota. And in this case, you have, this is for the orchids, and you have orchids that are ground living on trees and so on. Some are vines. And so they do really cross-cut the higher level. Although the otarate is a basic term, it's an example where a basic term exists in the taxonomy that can cross-cut the higher levels of the taxonomy. Here it's an interesting case because, yeah, okay, I just want to conclude here. The example of Ororingohana, this is, has a good form and a bad form. It's a weed form, and the good one is useful. One in the jungle, one in the village. As it says here, the village has male and female, or black and white. So the male is known, and when looking at it, we talked about this, and everybody concluded that, that there must be somewhere in the jungle, go back, there must be somewhere in the jungle another form here. There must be a female somewhere in the jungle. We'll have to find that someday. So what I'm trying to show here is that the way the classificatory system works, people use their folk classification in the same way chemists in the past used our periodical table of the elements to predict the existence of chemicals that they had not yet observed. And you also have growth classes of fish, and it's no longer moving. And anyway, and when you come up with the list of names that you're looking for, some interesting things happen. The Morihuhutu was one that we had never come up with and found, but people asked about it because we saw the name, and where people were trying to remember different names. And they said, well, there's a place in Dodinga where it exists. And once held up at Dodinga when I was waiting for a boat, I said, let's go see if somebody knows where Morihuhutu is, that plant. And there were some trees there, and I collected one set of vouchers. And this actually ended up being later described as a new genus, Paracabara, the monomyceae. And this is part of the isotype, which is here. So it's known only from the type specimen and the isotypes from the same tree. To this day, I believe it's the only one that ever collected of that genus. Dylan Ripley asked me, because we all have to find this rail, which is only known from one example in England at the British Museum. And with the image, we were able to locate it, and people have found it for me. So I do want to say that later, working on exhibits jointly with Indonesian and other Southeast Asian organizations, and working on sort of museum collection studies, I was interested to discover that many of my colleagues working with me in the field of Indonesian art and material culture actually began with the study of ethnobotany or ethnobiology, like Maribel Gettinger, textile consultant for this exhibit. And that has also informed my work on William Louis Abbott, who lived from 1860 to 1936. Several examples of papers going through his archives and notes. He collected in all over Asia and Southeast Asia, also in East Africa. And the nature of his collecting for mammals, birds, and ethnographic material was rather different. It reflects a lot of different presumptions. I will just say that in going through his notes and his records, I've been one by one writing about the kinds of information that he found. And I will just conclude by saying that the ethnobiological work that I did with an indigenous people has led me to a lot of better interpretations, not only of his own writings and the notes that he made, including notes like this about things that he didn't collect that are not in our collections, but also working with our collections. In this case, for example, ethnomusicology of Thailand, and more recently, joint work with the Queen Sirikit Institute in Thailand, which has itself working with me for over a period of decades, been very active in trying to identify endangered types of locally useful plants and craft traditions at the same time. So this climbing fern that was used to make a particular type of basket was revived, the work was revived, and it then was developed as a marketable technique being used today. These are some of the other papers on Abbott's work, and I was very interested that between his 2 trips to Thailand, Abbott even went off to Florida to fight in the Spanish-American War because he wanted to rush back to fight in the war when it started. And those papers of his work as a volunteer in the Cuban insurgency ended up in his Southeast Asian field notes. So I just published those this past year, another serendipitous discovery that the historians of the Spanish-American War were very happy about because of all things, this type of firsthand account of volunteer service in militia fighting in Cuba is extremely rare. So sometimes it's nice to accidentally discover things on the margins of what you're actually looking for. And that's, I guess, one of the main themes too. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Unfortunately, we do not have time for any questions. I personally am dying to ask you a couple of questions. I'm sorry, but yeah. So our next speaker is Logan Kistler.